Hello, I'm Nina Melendez, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Today, we're talking about great expectations and great failures. Think of that popular kid in high school who was voted most likely to succeed, but then never launched, or that employee who was the star colleague when they arrived, then failed miserably when they got to the top. Why do some high performers stay the course their whole lives, but others do a complete 180 after just a few great successes? Well, joining me now is Dirk Deichmann. He is associate professor at Rotterdam School of Management. He focuses on the determinants and consequences of behavior and is co-author of the recent study, Great Successes and Great Failures. He was an assistant professor at VU University Amsterdam, and he got his master's and PhD at Rotterdam School of Management. Dirk, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nina.
So good to have you. I want to start by talking about successes, right? So for the most part, people kind of hop from success to success throughout their career. And this is known as the Matthew effect. Can you explain to us what exactly that is?
Yeah, absolutely. The Matthew effect refers basically to the principle of the rich get richer. So once you scored a success, you get additional resources, additional support from others, which help you to then actually improve and score another success.
And so in your studies, you described high status actors, and a high status actor, if you can just sort of explain, I'm going to run through it, but tell me if I'm right or wrong. They do well, they're high performers, and in addition to being high performers, they're also pretty popular in the group that they're in. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Because, I mean, you turn to high status people because they have something. They performed well in the past. They have, a good network, actually. And so you also see that then back in who's actually a high status person. These are those people that usually have a broad network, a far-reaching network, because a lot of people want to, connect to them, align with them, get their advice maybe, and so those people that are high in the status hierarchy, they usually have that kind of network structure.
Again, so then the Matthew effect then completely makes sense, because the more popular you are, then the more opportunities come your way. So what about the inverse of that? Is there an opposite to the Matthew effect? Is there something that's called the non-Matthew effect?
I don't know. Good question.
Well, we mentioned it here on LinkedIn News Live. Let's the non-Matthew effect. Actually, so let me take a moment and say hi to some of our viewers who are joining us today. They're joining us from all over the world. We've got Chris from Vegas, Willie from Dallas, Anouk from Japan. Thank you so much for joining. And I wanted to ask our viewers a question of the day. It's all about performance. Do you perform better when the expectations are high or when they're low? Do you take on these great expectations and perform well, or does the pressure get to you and do you fail miserably? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe we can ask Dirk some of this as a follow-up. Dirk, part of your research on great successes and great failures, right, was about how project performance can vary throughout the different projects for these highly successful folks. Can you explain what that variance is?
Yeah, so we did a study in the context of video games. So we looked into all the kind of video games from 1972 onwards and who was working on which kind of video game. There's a database similar to IDMB, which is called mobygames.com, where we pulled that information from. And then we looked into the user and critique ratings of these video games. And that was our performance variable then, determining which kind of project that was led by some kind of project leader was scoring very high on these ratings or very low. We also did additional analysis where we just simply looked into the sales of video game, and our analysis are pretty much consistent across these different operationalizations of these variables.
in the article that you wrote that you co-authored for the Harvard Business Review, you actually gave an example of a filmmaker in 1981. Right. Yeah, and I'd love to actually talk about the non-Matthew effect. You coined it the Michael effect. I don't remember the name of who is the filmmaker? Michael
Cimino.
Cimino, right. Yeah. So all these great expectations because he had made these films that were so wonderful and so well received, and then they put all this money into the next budget for his next film, and it completely bombed. So can you explain a little bit from what you've seen in your studies, like what exactly accounts for that complete failure when there's so much riding on someone's shoulders?
Yeah, so that's a good question indeed. And that was the driving force behind the study, because we know that sometimes high status has these positive effects, what we referred to earlier as the Matthew effect. You get richer, you get more resources, people supporting you more, and that really helps you sometimes to perform also better over the time. But sometimes, now let's call it the non-Matthew effect, it might also work against you, having this very high status. Because what happens, and that was our theory, is that people get overloaded with these requests by others. You're very prominent in a network, and so a lot of people approach you. And that can, overload you and even distract you from actually working on a project, on implementing a project. So there's also a negative side to high status. If you have too much, maybe you're overloaded with these requests by others, and then you get distracted. So that's one thing that can happen, and that can explain why sometimes high status project leaders actually score low on performance. And then there was another thing that we looked into, and that was that sometimes high status actors, they're also more powerful, right? So in a project decision or project selection process, they sometimes can convince people more easily, even if they have really crappy ideas or crappy products or projects, just like this Cimino director. Apparently, he was having a good idea before, scored very well, so he had kind of a high status in the industry, and then could easily collect resources for his new project. But no one really looked into...
The new project was such a bad idea.
Yeah, no one looked into it anymore. Like, is this actually a good, film? Or, shouldn't we scrutinize it a little bit more? So I think he got these resources pretty easily. And that's also something that I think that's the main thing that we want to explain in the paper.
I want to go back to that first part that you talked about, piling onto more work to high status actors. Isn't part of what makes them high status and high performers is that they're able to take on that work, like they can, that they don't say no. Is there a correlation at all between high status people and people who don't know how to set boundaries and say, no to more work?
I mean, that's a good question, Nina. I'm not sure about earlier research looking into the exact correlations of that, but it makes intuitive sense that if you have high status, you had to work pretty hard to get there. And I mean, part of it sometimes is luck, but the other part is a lot of work actually that goes into it. And so usually you are able to execute these projects very well. And so, but at some point you reach maybe a maximum of your capacity. And especially if you work in very large organizations, that can then come at your detriment. Unless you have created some kind of mechanisms for yourself that allow you to still perform very well while being in this very central network position, having this high status and this prominence in your organization. And we make some recommendations about it in the piece as well.
I want to hear what those are in just a moment. Let's say hi to some more people who are joining us. Again, we've got Doba from New York, George from Lebanon, and Kemi from London. And again, we'd love to hear Yeah, all over the place. We'd
Yeah.
love to hear from you. You know, do you perform better when the expectations are high or low? What are your thoughts? If you have moved up in your company, have you found that it's been easier then to do really well, or has it been more difficult? Let us know. We'll bring them up. Please join in the conversation. Or if you have any questions for Dirk, now is the time to ask. He's here live. He'll answer all your questions. There's something that I thought was really interesting that you wrote in your study was how you can have, you know, this idea of popularity, how you can have a popular high performer do the same quality of work as a like non-popular high performer, but the work done by the popular person will be valued more. And again, to the Matthew effect of like the rich getting richer, that then person will continue to move on. So that immediately made me think of the idea of meritocracy and this whole idea of meritocracy. What have your findings shown in light of that?
So actually our findings show that there's a sweet spot that if you have not too high and not too low status, that makes you perform the best, because then you have the benefits, a bit of the status, the resources, the support you get from others, but you don't really go into the slippery slope of what we explained earlier, of this very too high status. And what we then see is when you then compare the very high status project leaders with the low status project leaders, you see that on average they are scoring similar, which is pretty shocking actually for these very high status leaders. But for the high status leaders, there's much more variance. So some score extremely well and some score extremely badly. And so the average is somewhere in between, of course. And yeah, what this means for meritocracy is that I think you still need a good selection process in the end in your organization. We will never be all equal. There will always be some kind of hierarchy in an organization, whether it's explicit or implicit. And it's about finding the right selection mechanisms for projects that look at the project and the idea or the product idea that you're having, rather than so much at who's implementing that idea.
I think it's so interesting that you say that really just to kind of skirt in the middle is the way to success. It's like don't achieve too much and don't become too popular, but don't.
Yeah.
It's like the happy medium. That's fascinating. I want to bring up actually, let's talk about the failure part of it now too. It's really interesting to me. So I'm going to bring up a quote from your findings, right? You say that high status leaders should experience less resistance to their projects, and this is because other people will be less critical of a project when it is led by someone who has a high status. Given their better network connections to decision makers, they can interact with them more directly and can discuss and alleviate any skepticism they may have about the project. So we touched on this before, and it just really sounds like all of the guardrails that are there to prevent massive failures are removed the more one moves up the chain and becomes more popular, more powerful. What are some ways to prevent this kind of failure?
Yeah, so indeed, that's important. And we are discussing 5 different ways what companies or individuals could do. And it starts with formalizing the project selection process, as I alluded to before. Have criteria why you want to go for a certain project or not. You know, what's behind it? Does it need to be novel, useful? Does it need to have a lot of value? You know, what are your formalized criteria for selecting a project or not? And then the attention idea shifts more towards that project and whether it's good or bad, and whether you should implement it. Because the problem that we identified earlier is that the reason why these high status project leaders score so bad is because they were able to implement bad projects. They were getting through in the selection process with bad projects. So the focus needs to be on filtering out these bad projects. Another thing that you could do is to consider introducing an anonymous submission system, for instance, or an anonymous procedure where it's not where you don't have the name of the project leader associated to it when you have to make a decision about the project or not. So that's in academia, we have a double-blind review process. When we submit the paper, our name of the authors is not visible to the people that are evaluating and reviewing the paper. So that's an anonymous process, and I don't see the name of the reviewers either. So they can really focus on your work instead of on who you are, whether you're a prominent scholar or not, and things like that. And then you get influenced by these things.
That's great. We should adopt that in corporate America.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Caroline in the stream. She asks, how has remote work impacted high performers? Do you have any data on that or any insight from some of your past research?
Yeah, that's really a good question, Caroline. At the moment, we are running research projects on this. Now that we're, getting out of the pandemic slowly but steadily. So I don't have yet really data to support anything of this. But I think what you could say is that in terms of crisis, you always revert more to simple heuristics. And when there's a lot of uncertainty, in that case, even high status people are turned to even more because you have an expectation that they will anyhow do well and perform okay. When you need to make for instance, selection about a project that is led by a low status person, and you have increasing uncertainty, with the environment in the pandemic, like, can we really afford now trying out a project with a low status person? Then what usually happens is that then it becomes even worse. So I would think that our results are even worse in a pandemic situation, that high status people are even more scoring either super good or super bad.
Something that you mentioned earlier about the anonymous review that happens in academia, and also just these ideas that go through that don't get reviewed or don't really have the stop gaps in place. It just sounds like there should be more constructive criticism. And you mentioned this in your paper as well. Can you talk about the importance of it, but B, like where it should come from? Who should it come from to really review projects before they launch and they're bad projects? Yeah.
Indeed, that's one of our recommendations, which are based on our findings, where we saw that to reiterate is that sometimes high status people were getting through the selection process of their projects with sometimes bad ideas and bad proposals. So what you see is that a lot of these people that are very prominent, that have a high status, no one dares to challenge them anymore, to criticize them, to say, hey, I don't know if I like this idea, whether that's really the big next thing that we should invest millions of euros or dollars into. So what one suggestion is that we then made is you need to surround yourself by people that dare to speak up to you. And you need to create an environment yourself that allows that also. So maybe as a high status person, as someone with a lot of prominence in an organization, maybe you didn't do that explicitly that you're no longer open for criticism, but people are the other end, the people that advise you or that consult you, they increasingly become scared to say something wrong or something like that. So it's really, that's one recommendation where everyone can work on themselves to create an environment that allows that, and that can take really multiple forms. Either you really talk to people where you say you have a few people that that you proactively invite to challenge you, or I don't know, you have an agenda item on the next meeting where this is like a point where now I would like to hear criticism. So that it's not only like cheering up, great project, but that you formalize it in a way that like, okay, there is also a part where we can improve, where I can improve.
You make it part of the process initially.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that you said to dare for high performers to dare to surround themselves with people who will criticize them. And I think that that's potentially very difficult for people, especially, I'm sure, one's own ego. The better you do, the more you're like, yeah, I'm awesome. And I don't,
I mean, it's flattering.
How much of psychology is involved here, and ego, and not wanting to know, or not wanting to think that you can fail? If you've had so many successes, maybe failure doesn't even seem like an option. What have you found?
Yeah, it becomes increasingly difficult, right? The more you are on this path of success, the more you are in this bubble, and the more you are on the hierarchy where the air is pretty thin, right? On the top of the hierarchy. So yeah, it is challenging, but the more important it becomes also. I think that's what our study really shows. You can be lucky and score really still extremely well, but sometimes you can burn millions of euros, and that will threaten not only your own career, but also the longevity of your company, because sometimes one failure is enough to, question everything.
Yeah. When I think of great expectations and great failures, Dirk, I think of people like Elizabeth Holmes, like Lance Armstrong, unfortunately, people who just excelled so well and were just on this path to great success, and just completely collapsed because of bad decisions and bad acting, I suppose one could say. Is there something that you've noticed in your findings that, perhaps does it happen more predominantly to certain types of people, certain personality types, or anything like that? Have you noticed when you look at all of the many of them who've risen to prominence and then just, failed miserably? Anything that you've noticed?
Yeah, well, in our study, we focused on video games and producers or project leaders of these video games. And we didn't study misconduct or any fraudulent behavior. That said, I think I could speculate a little bit about it. So I don't assume that any of these video game producers was in some way misbehaving or doing some misconduct. But I think our recommendations nevertheless also hold for these people like Lance Armstrong, Elizabeth Holmes, as you mentioned, because they focus on when you are looking into formalizing the process and getting a high performing person out of this bubble, that will also help that person to always check base with what's actually happening around me, and check with the reality actually. When you surround yourself with people that can openly criticize you, when you have this more formalized process, when you, for instance, have this anonymous idea of providing feedback, or you could also try to think of not overloading this person with administrative burdens and things like that. So all of these things, I think, help to create an environment where at least you could stop. You would have been able to stop these behaviors of Elizabeth Holmes and Lance Armstrong much earlier than now, what we saw now, because in the environment that they were in, they were just
so permissive.
going on. Yeah, no one stopped them, right? Because they also had an interest often in them continuing on their path.
Yeah. Before I let you go, last question. So if you're a manager and you have high performers in your team, I'm winking at my boss here. What should you do to look out to protect your direct reports? So we know feedback is good, and also not overburdening them with work. Also,
yes, listen carefully.
Some advice for managers. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, also don't celebrate your stars too much. That would be also one. So look at the whole team. I mean, it's usually really a team effort also. And even though we all know this, in the end, the project leader or the star usually takes all the benefit. And the team just, moves to the next project. But I think that's one thing besides all the other things that we discussed is like focus really on the team, because that will also take away pressure from just one person and the strange ideas or the cool ideas or the peculiarities of that person.
Dirk, it was so great speaking with you. We really appreciate you joining us. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but thank you again for sharing your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Dirk Deichmann. He is an associate professor at the School of Management, Rotterdam University. And you can continue the conversation here for all of those who joined and participated in the conversation, or you can check out other stories we've got for you to the right of your feed, or if you're on mobile, click into the search box. On Thursday, my colleague Caroline Fairchild has a great show for you. She'll be talking the creator economy with TikTokers who are developing entire businesses based on content that they post on social media. She digs into the pluses and minuses of this unconventional job and just how lucrative it can be. I'm Nina Melendez. Thanks again for watching LinkedIn News Live.